Welcome to the first episode of our new series entitled Of Sound Mind. This series focuses on cognitive aging and all that goes with it. It is sponsored by the Stanford Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Now, have you ever misplaced your car keys or your house keys and said to yourself, oh my gosh, I wonder if I'm getting Alzheimer's? Well, you're not alone in that. And I'll bet you've also thought to yourself, is there anything I can do? Is there anything that's supported by research that would help me to keep my brain healthy so that it will reduce the chances that I'm going to get Alzheimer's later in life? Well, if you've thought about those two topics, that's what we're focusing on in this particular show. I'm the host of this series. My name is Dolores Gallagher Thompson, and I'm a geropsychologist. And what that means is that I focus on the mental health problems of later life, particularly depression and dementia. I've worked clinically with patients and their families for about 20 years, and I'm also a professor of research in the Department of Psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine. And my research career, I've developed a number of interventions to help patients and families to cope with their various illnesses, depression, dementia, and so forth, and to help them have as good quality of life as possible. Now, it is with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce our guest for tonight's show, and that is Dr. Frank Longo. Dr. Longo is a distinguished professor and chair of the Department of Neurology and Neurological Sciences at Stanford University School of Medicine. His clinical interests are in Huntington's disease and Alzheimer's disease, and his research focus is on cellular signaling mechanisms, which leads to the development of therapeutics that can help in the treatment of these disorders. So, Dr. Longo, we're very glad to have you here tonight to help us to understand the difference between a healthy aging brain, what it looks like, and what a brain looks like that has experienced cognitive insults.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. So the topic of a healthy aging brain, of course, is very important that we all wonder about. And when we think about healthy cognitive aging, it's important to know what we mean by cognition. And as a neurologist, we think about cognition in various areas. So we have memory function, and we also have the ability for visual spatial function. We use that when we're driving. We have what we call executive function. That's the ability to multitask. We have our verbal abilities and other areas. So in healthy cognitive aging, we're able to maintain these functions fairly well into our 80s and 90s, and in some cases beyond. Now, with normal aging, the ability to memorize new things slows down a little bit. The ability to multitask slows down a little bit. But in general, they don't affect day-to-day function much. And now, interestingly, our verbal ability improves into our 70s and 80s and beyond. Our ability to make judgments and apply past experience improves. So that's healthy aging. Now, unfortunately, some of us will experience a cognitive loss that's severe and does affect our day-to-day function, and that's unhealthy cognitive aging.
Yeah. So it sounds like there are different things that can happen to the brain that result in these changes. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What are some of the brain changes that occur?
Sure. That's been a big topic of research in recent years. What happens to the brain during cognitive aging where one is unfortunately losing cognitive abilities? We can look at the brain, an image of the brain from the surface, just looking at the brain overall. And in the first image here, we have on the left a healthy looking brain. And on the right, we have a brain that has shrunk. We use the term atrophy. Now, a little bit of shrinkage, a little bit of atrophy is a normal part of healthy aging. However, in situations such as dementia or Alzheimer's disease, we get too much of this atrophy or brain shrinkage, and that's associated with too much loss of cognitive function. Now, we can go deeper inside the brain, inside one of these shrinking brains, and look at a next image that looks deeper inside the brain. And in that brain that's shrinking, we see the accumulation of two abnormal proteins. One is called amyloid, and the other one's called tau, an abnormal form of the tau protein. And as the amyloid and tau accumulate, it's toxic to the nerve cells or neurons within the brain. So how does it damage these neurons? We can go to an even deeper look, another image deeper in the brain, and we can look at the individual nerve cells or neurons in the brain, and those are represented by these blue circles there. Now, believe it or not, each of us have 100 billion nerve cells in our brain. It's quite a few. And what's even more amazing, each one of these nerve cells can have 1,000 or up to 10,000 connections, and we call these connections synaptic connections. So on the image we're looking at there on the left-hand side, we have a nerve cell in blue extending its axon towards the right, and that axon is making a synaptic connection with the dendrite of the second neuron. And that synapse is the key. Because in healthy aging, we're able to maintain those synaptic connections, but in unhealthy aging, we start to lose these synaptic connections. And once we lose these synaptic connections, we lose our ability to remember new things, to recall our memories, or in some cases, to have verbal ability, etc.
So it sounds like in an unhealthy brain, a number of changes are occurring. So you have the smaller size, the shrinkage, then you have the accumulation of these abnormal proteins, and then you have the lack of the synaptic connections.
Right, all leading to the loss of those synaptic connections, and that's sort of the bottom line. Without these synaptic connections, we don't have normal cognition or memory or other cognitive skills.
Now, you mentioned Alzheimer's disease and dementia, and I wonder, are those terms used interchangeably, or can you help us understand?
Sure, that's a common question. People often ask me, what's the difference between a dementia and Alzheimer's disease? A dementia is a broad term that we use, really simply meaning that if a person has a dementia, they've lost their cognitive abilities in two or more areas of cognition that I mentioned, memory, function, and perhaps visual spatial function. They've lost enough ability in two or more areas of cognition to affect day-to-day function, and we'll say that person has a dementia. Now, there are many different causes of dementia. It turns out that Alzheimer's disease is by far the most common cause of dementia. So really, Alzheimer's is just a certain form of dementia.
I see. So it's important then perhaps to distinguish between these different forms of dementia, at least for some patients.
Sure. So one of the jobs of the neurologist and one of the services we provide at the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center and our Center at Neurology at Stanford is to really figure out the cause of the dementia in a patient. And in most cases, unfortunately, it is Alzheimer's disease.
Okay. So that leads to the next question that I think many viewers in our audience would have, and that is, what can we do? You know, what does the research tell us are some things that we can do that would either reduce our chances of getting Alzheimer's or some other form of dementia, or delay the onset?
Right.
So can you share some things with us?
So strategies for trying to prevent the onset of dementia, and especially Alzheimer's, are one of the most common questions in our clinic at Stanford. Obviously a very important question that we're all concerned about. Many possibilities have come up that we hear about. We hear about healthy diet, and the Mediterranean diet is perhaps one of the more common forms of a healthy diet. There are other forms. That's been looked at. A second strategy would be so-called brain exercises. It might consist of crossword puzzles, or more recently, exercises on the computer to exercise our brain, our memory, other functions. And then a third strategy that's been discussed quite a bit recently is physical exercise. And there's quite a bit of discussion which of these are more effective, which ones have the best evidence. And those are the three popular ones right now, approaches.
So which of those would you say has the most weight of evidence behind it?
Sure, interesting question. Which of these three is most effective and has the best evidence? Right now, the best data that we have is for physical exercise. Of these three approaches, it looks like physical exercise is perhaps the most powerful strategy for either lowering the odds of getting a dementia, including Alzheimer's disease, or at least delaying the onset significantly, or if we're in early stages of it, slowing its progression. Physical exercise by far. There's some data about healthy diet, and a lot of those studies include the Mediterranean diet. There's some studies supporting the brain exercises. They're probably the least well supported and most controversial at this point.
So now when you say exercise, does that mean that I've got to go out this weekend and do a 10K run? Is that what you're referring to? Or hopefully not, right?
Sure. What do we mean by exercise?
Yeah,
and of course, that's all of my patients and families want to know. And I think for many of us that haven't been exercising all of our lives, it's daunting to think about, now I have to start exercising. I've never even been to a gym in 20 years. How can I start exercising? Fortunately, there's good news here. Most of the studies that examine exercise include relatively small amounts of exercise, modest amounts. So studies will test 3 or 4 or 5 days a week of about 30 minutes a day of modest exercise. So those are the kinds of exercise doses that we're looking at. So not running 10Ks, not running marathons.
That's a relief.
It's levels of exercise that most of us can fortunately handle. Perhaps the most formal or quantitative way of looking at that is, in all exercise, the goal is to get our heart rate up, to get the exercise effect that's good for the brain. Moderate exercise would be getting our heart rate up to about 65% of the predicted maximum heart rate for our age. And your doctor or you can help you, or on websites will tell you how to calculate the maximum heart rate for your age and gender. And the goal is to get to 65% of that rate. Now that requires taking our pulse, which is a little bit inconvenient. A second way to judge modest exercise is if, let's say, we're taking a brisk walk with a friend, that we would break a sweat in about 10 minutes. That's a modest level of exercise in a normal temperature. And finally, perhaps the easiest, if we were taking that brisk walk with a friend, if we're at a modest level, it would be difficult to have a normal conversation with complete sentences. That would be a modest effect.
Yeah, I've heard that last one referred to as the talk test.
Right, the talk test is perfectly appropriate.
Yeah, okay. So it sounds like eating well and using our brains as much as we can and exercising to a moderate degree are all helpful.
They're all helpful, and as researchers we think about them individually, and as I mentioned, I think physical exercise probably has the most impressive data. However, a recent trend really is to think that probably doing all three is really the best thing to do. So it's really a lifestyle change where we're taking all three approaches, and they reinforce each other.
That would certainly make sense. Now, in my reading about this topic, I've also run across the idea that maybe sleep contributes in some way to the development or worsening of these dementia conditions.
Right.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. Sleep is a very interesting recent area, and it's the question for a while has been, does lack of sleep promote Alzheimer's or make it more likely, or is it that people in early stages of dementia, even before they realized they were having any problems, have sleep problems? So it's a chicken and egg problem. Which comes first, lack of sleep or developing the Alzheimer's? And the recent studies suggest that it may be that a lack of sleep might make it more likely to get Alzheimer's. And in fact, it's quite interesting. I mentioned the accumulation of amyloid in the brain causing degeneration of the brain, and that's part of Alzheimer's. Quite interestingly, there's evidence suggesting that when we're at sleep at night, there's a clearance mechanism in our brain that can clear out this extra amyloid while we're sleeping. And some of the greatest clearance occurs in that last couple hours of sleep. So that may be an explanation of why sleep's important. We need more research in the field, but in the meantime, it might be a good idea to try to get full night's sleep, if possible. It can be difficult, but it's a good goal.
And what would a full night's sleep be? You know, how many hours would that
Yeah,
be?
typically the sleep researchers talk about 8 hours. I think for many of us that would be difficult.
Yeah.
But I try to get in the range of 7 to 8, something like that. Probably 4 or 5 is not enough. I don't want people to be frustrated because as we age, of course, it's harder to get sleep. And many of us have difficulty, and we do our best with what we call sleep hygiene. And again, we have a sleep program at Stanford that can help people with that.
Yeah, well, so we'll add that then to the list, right, of things that we should do. And, you know, as a psychologist, I've also been reading about another factor that seems like it's been mentioned in the research literature a few times, and that is the whole idea of social connectedness, that maintaining a social network and social activity, that's yet another way of promoting brain health.
Sure.
So what do you think about that?
I think the social connectedness or so-called social engagement is very important. We saw that picture of the synaptic connections, and those synaptic connections are almost like a muscle. It's a use it or lose it. And when we don't use these synaptic connections, they tend to wither away faster. So when we're in social connection, we're using these synaptic connections. So that social engagement is very important. Now it's much harder to study, so we don't have as much data or information on the impact of social engagement. But my hunch, as somebody who studied the brain for a long time, is that it's very important. Our brain needs a challenge, and our brain enjoys engaging with a complex environment. And I think one of the most complicated things in our environment is another person. So I think it's great for our brains.
Couldn't agree more. So it sounds like there are a number of things we can do, and that if we did at least a few of them on a regular basis, we would probably be decreasing our odds of developing dementia later in life.
There are, you know, we've outlined a number of things people can do, and I think my patients, my families enjoy playing an active role in this. I mean, I think we want to get away from being passive and hoping we don't get it, because there are things we can actively do that we are talking about here. And if we can just delay onset of dementia by 5 years, just delay it by 5 years. We're not talking about cure it initially. I mean, we'd love to cure it at some point. If we delay onset by 5 years, we would eliminate 90% of the Alzheimer's in our population. So delaying onset's very powerful, and these strategies that we're talking about, I think, do play a role.
Well, I really appreciate that you've shared that and made it clear to our viewers what we can do to help ourselves. But I know that sometimes, despite the best efforts, we still have a diagnosis of dementia to deal with. So if that is the case and the person has a diagnosis of dementia, could you share with us what are some of the currently available treatments and what's on the horizon? You know, what can we look forward to?
Sure. So what can we do if a person does end up having Alzheimer's? Well, the first thing that we do as a neurologist, we always want to confirm the diagnosis. Is there a dementia there? If so, is it Alzheimer's? So that's the first step, is really have a thorough evaluation to confirm that diagnosis. If Alzheimer's is diagnosed, we have 2 categories of FDA-approved medications, and these currently available medications, what they do is they boost what we call the neurotransmitter chemicals at these synaptic connections, and they improve the function at the synapses a little bit, so they can have some help with memory and other cognitive functions. So that can help patients, so we start these medications. However, unfortunately, they don't slow the underlying degeneration or progression of the disease, so they really can't prevent it or slow it down, but they can help on day-to-day function for a while. So we always try these medications. So that's our main strategy at this point, along with making sure the patients are getting other good medical care, such as dealing with their hypertension or diabetes, because these medical problems can also accelerate the dementia process.
So would it be fair to say at this point then that there is really no cure for Alzheimer's?
Unfortunately, at this point in 2016, there is no cure for Alzheimer's, unfortunately. However, there is considerable work and potential therapies that are being developed in the pipeline, some with at Stanford, some with my research group, but all over the world, that I think show promise in coming up with drugs that will really be more powerful than the ones we have now to either delay onset so much that we won't deal with it, or to dramatically slow progression, or better yet, one of the drugs we're working on can actually reverse this loss of synaptic connections. So we'll see these come out. It'll take a while, over the next 5, 7, 8 years, and every couple years we'll get a little step in progress. It won't be all at once.
So could you share with us some of the research that's going on in your lab at Stanford?
Sure. My research team is working on developing ways to counteract the neurodegenerative process that occurs in Alzheimer's disease. And so we have found that there are some naturally occurring proteins in the brain that are very powerful in maintaining those synaptic connections. And these proteins themselves can't be used as drugs, but we've invented drug type of compounds that are as powerful as these naturally occurring proteins, and they are showing an ability, at least in early studies, to maintain those synaptic connections. So we're in the early stages of research, but we hope that these will advance to become drugs that we can use at some point.
That sounds really, really interesting.
We are optimistic about developing effective therapies. There's been so much progress in the field of neuroscience and brain research that this is really the time to make a difference in this disease.
Well, this leads me to ask you a little bit more about this Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at Stanford, because it sounds like at least some of your work is embedded in the center.
Yes.
So could you tell us, if I thought I had dementia or Alzheimer's, I was worried about it, would I go to the center? How could this center help me?
Yes, so our center brings together the different services that you really need for good care. Being assessed for the presence of cognitive impairment, dementia, and figuring out what it is really involves several different teams. So for example, we have a group of neuropsychologists that can do the careful cognitive assessments that are required. We have geropsychiatrists that have expertise in assessing behavioral issues. We have a whole large team of neurologists that can do the careful neurologic exams and studies to really make an accurate diagnosis. So we have physical therapists and occupational therapists. So we're bringing whole teams together in one location, in one spot, so our patient doesn't have to make many different visits in many different locations. So it's much more efficient. And then perhaps most exciting is we're offering research right there in the same location that patients are getting their care. We're offering the opportunity to participate in research, and that can be great for some of our patients and families.
So in the research studies that you're describing, do you exclusively focus on patients, or do you sometimes need other groups besides patients to volunteer for research?
Well, in many ways, the most important parts of research studies in this field are including a group of normal volunteers. Quite a bit of the research we do is on brain imaging, for example, finding better ways to detect or predict Alzheimer's disease. And we always need to look at volunteers that have normal brain function. So we're always comparing the normal brain function to the abnormal brain function that occurs in Alzheimer's disease. So it's really our normal volunteers that make it all possible, and they're helping to move this field forward along with our Alzheimer's patients and their families.
So if I weren't concerned that I might have Alzheimer's or some other kind of dementia, might I be eligible for some of these research studies?
Sure. If you yourself aren't concerned that you have beginnings of Alzheimer's, you very well might be eligible for our studies as a normal volunteer, and you would be contributing so much to the field. Our normal volunteers have a lot of fun learning about the field, participating, making a contribution that has a worldwide impact. Many times our normal volunteers have a friend that's been affected with Alzheimer's, or a family member, and they're looking for ways to make a difference in the field. And what a pleasant way to make a difference. They get to spend some time with some wonderful people, learn about the field, and actually be one of the people making that contribution.
So it sounds like this Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at Stanford is really set up to work with patients, families, and these normal or healthy volunteers. Is that
exactly.
correct?
It's meant to be a
Yeah.
one-stop
Okay.
shop
Okay.
to help us provide clinical care, to help us engage with our normal volunteers, and really to bring it all together to both provide good care and also to advance this field so that at some point our children or our grandchildren will not be dealing with this. And it's important to know that for those of us that have had a parent or a sibling with Alzheimer's, we're at increased risk.
Yeah, so the center, I understand, is fairly newly established, is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so is it set up yet to actually receive phone calls and to take referrals?
We are up and running. So during the past year, we were excited to learn that the National Institutes of Health selected Stanford for one of these prestigious centers. We have an amazing team already assembled, and we're ready to receive calls.
Okay, well, thank you so much for all that you have shared with us tonight. I would like to give you an opportunity to add anything that we haven't covered yet. Is there anything that you think is important for the audience to know that we would like to close with?
I think what's important for our audience to know is that these activities and actions that we talked about, exercise, staying socially engaged, healthy diet, make a difference. So we can take the bull by the horns, so to speak, and make a difference. And sometimes people have done all these things and they still may end up getting Alzheimer's later in their life. And people say, well, did it make a difference? I say, yes, they probably bought themselves 5 or 10 good years. So we can make a difference. And I would also share with people, for our normal potential volunteers out there, come and help move a field forward in a beautiful location with many fun and pleasant people to work with.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great segue into the last portion of our show, which is really to encourage people to think seriously about volunteering for the studies and for the center. At the bottom of your screen, you will see the telephone number. That is the best number to use. We are excited to receive your calls. We're enthusiastic to talk with you. Christina, who will respond to your phone calls, will answer your questions and help you understand whether or not you would be an eligible volunteer to participate in the studies at the center. We definitely encourage you to seriously consider this, and we hope we will hear from you. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to remind you all that this is the first show in a series of shows that we have planned for you in this calendar year of 2016. And we have some very interesting future shows coming up. One will focus on Parkinson's disease, and it will focus on the relationship between Parkinson's disease, cognitive impairment, and Lewy body dementia, which is really an important area of study and one that this particular center is specializing in.